The two officers who arrived at my gate that afternoon were doing everything in their power not to laugh, and I want to describe the exact moment I noticed it, because it was the first sign I had that this entire absurd situation might actually resolve itself considerably faster than I'd expected. Priscilla Whitfield stood beside her car, arms crossed, insisting with complete seriousness that I had unlawfully imprisoned two Hollow Ridge Estates residents by installing a locked gate across my own private driveway. And Officer Delacroix, the younger of the two responding deputies, had his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle working, clearly fighting the same reaction his partner was failing to fully suppress. My name is Desmond Kessler. I'm 54 years old, and I own 11 acres at the end of a private gravel driveway connecting to the county highway, land my family has held since 1961. Decades before Hollow Ridge Estates ever broke ground on the parcel bordering my own property. I want to explain, before describing anything else, exactly how installing a simple gate across my own driveway somehow resulted in a homeowners association president standing in front of sheriff's deputies accusing me of kidnapping. I need to back up considerably, because the gate itself was the culmination of nearly 3 years of a persistent, low-grade dispute that had been building steadily before it ever reached the point of an actual 911 call. Hollow Ridge Estates developed a small footpath, sometime around their second year of existence, that residents had begun using as an informal shortcut connecting their own community walking trail system to a scenic overlook on the ridge above my property. A shortcut that happened to run directly across a corner of my own driveway before continuing onto a public easement beyond it. I want to be clear that I never objected to occasional foot traffic crossing that corner of my property. What I objected to, increasingly over those 3 years, was the volume and behavior of that traffic gradually escalating from occasional hikers, politely acknowledging they were crossing private land into something closer to a constant, entitled thoroughfare, including, on several documented occasions, groups stopping to have picnics directly in my own driveway, treating my private gravel entrance as though it were simply an extension of the community's own recreational trail network. I raised these concerns directly with Priscilla Whitfield, president of the Hollow Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, on at least 4 separate occasions over those 3 years, each time receiving some version of the same dismissive response. "Mr. Kessler," she told me during our final conversation before I finally installed the gate, "our residents have been using that path for years. I really don't think a few hikers crossing the edge of your driveway is worth this much concern." I explained, as plainly as I know how, that the path crossed private property, that I had every legal right to restrict access to my own land regardless of how long informal use had continued, and that continued dismissal of my concerns would eventually require me to take more direct action. Priscilla's response, delivered with the particular confidence of someone who has never once considered that a neighbor's patience might have an actual limit, was simply that she doubted I would follow through. I installed the gate on a Tuesday morning, a simple manual swing gate with a padlock, positioned at the exact edge of my recorded property line, confirmed through a fresh survey I'd commissioned specifically to ensure I wasn't overstepping my own boundary by even an inch. I posted clear signage indicating private property, and I want to note plainly that the gate in no way blocked the public easement path continuing beyond my land. It simply prevented casual foot traffic from continuing to cross the specific corner of my own driveway that had, over 3 years, become an unofficial and increasingly disruptive shortcut. I want to describe what happened the following Saturday, because it directly led to the 911 call that eventually brought 2 sheriff's deputies to my property. 2 Hollow Ridge Estates residents, a couple I didn't personally know, approached the new gate mid-hike, found it locked, and rather than simply walking the short distance around to the actual public easement entrance, which remained fully accessible from the county road, called the association's own emergency contact line, reaching Priscilla directly, who then, apparently without pausing to consider the actual situation for more than a few seconds, called 911 herself, reporting that residents had been unlawfully trapped and confined by a locked gate blocking their only route home. I want to explain something important here, because it mattered enormously to how quickly the deputies resolved the entire situation once they actually arrived. The couple in question lived within Hollow Ridge Estates itself, accessible through the development's own primary entrance road, an entirely separate route from my own private driveway that had never, at any point, been their actual way home. They had simply been using my property as a recreational shortcut during a hike, and finding that shortcut blocked, rather than walking the additional 4 minutes back to the public easement path or the additional 15 minutes back to their own development's main entrance, had apparently decided the more efficient response was reporting an unlawful imprisonment. I arrived at the gate myself once I received a call from my own security camera system alerting me to activity at the property line, and found the scene already assembled. Priscilla standing beside her car, insisting loudly to the 2 deputies that I had trapped residents on my property, the couple themselves standing somewhat sheepishly to the side, and Officer Delacroix examining my gate with an expression I can only describe as barely restrained disbelief. "Sir," Officer Delacroix asked me once I'd introduced myself, "can you explain the situation here?" "This is my private property," I said, gesturing toward the survey stakes still visible along the boundary line. "I installed this gate on my own land, clearly marked with private property signage. These residents were using an informal shortcut across the corner of my driveway, found it now blocked, and apparently decided to call this in as an emergency rather than simply walking the short distance to the actual public path." I want to describe what happened next, because it represented the exact moment this entire situation shifted decisively in my favor. Officer Delacroix's partner, a considerably more senior deputy named Sergeant Alvarez, walked the property boundary herself, confirming the survey stakes matched the gate's actual position, and then turned to Priscilla with an expression that had entirely abandoned any pretense of taking the kidnapping accusations seriously. "Ma'am," Sergeant Alvarez said, "these residents were not trapped. They were on private property, found their preferred shortcut blocked, and had a full, unobstructed alternate route available the entire time, including the actual public easement they could see clearly from where they were standing. This isn't unlawful imprisonment. This is a locked gate on private land." Priscilla's composure, which had held through her initial dramatic accusation, began visibly faltering. "I was told residents were trapped," she said. "I responded to what I understood as an emergency." "Ma'am," Sergeant Alvarez continued, "I'd strongly encourage you to verify a situation more carefully before calling emergency dispatch in the future. Filing a report of unlawful imprisonment for a locked gate on someone's own private property, when an alternate route was clearly available, is the kind of call that wastes resources that could be responding to an actual emergency elsewhere in the county." I want to describe the moment I noticed both officers struggling not to laugh, because it happened almost simultaneously once Sergeant Alvarez turned back toward her patrol car and Officer Delacroix, apparently no longer needing to maintain a fully professional composure in front of his supervisor, allowed himself a brief, quiet exhale that was unmistakably a suppressed laugh. I want to be fair and note that neither officer was laughing at Priscilla in any cruel sense, but rather at the sheer scale of the disconnect between her dramatic 911 call and the actual mundane reality of a locked gate on private property with a perfectly accessible alternate route sitting in plain view the entire time. The 2 residents who had actually placed the original call to Priscilla, standing somewhat awkwardly through this entire exchange, eventually apologized to me directly, explaining they hadn't fully realized the gate sat on private property rather than the community trail itself, an explanation I accepted without any particular grudge, since my actual frustration had always been directed toward the pattern of dismissive HOA leadership, rather than any individual hiker who'd simply taken a wrong turn. I called an attorney the following week, a careful woman named Perpetua Alderidge, not because I intended to pursue any formal legal action against Priscilla personally, but because I wanted a properly documented record of the incident, along with a formal letter to the Hollow Ridge Estates Board making clear that any future informal shortcut across my property would result in the exact same response, and that continued dismissal of my repeated, reasonable requests over the preceding 3 years had directly led to an entirely avoidable emergency call wasting County Sheriff's Department resources. Perpetua's letter, once delivered, prompted the Hollow Ridge Estates Board to hold a session addressing the incident directly, and I attended, mostly out of curiosity about how the board would characterize what had, by that point, become something of a minor local legend among residents who'd heard the story secondhand. A board member named Cassius Delgado, who I hadn't dealt with directly before, asked Priscilla the question that seemed to capture the room's collective assessment of the entire situation. "Priscilla," he said, "you called 911 to report a kidnapping over a locked gate on someone else's private property, without verifying a single detail first. What exactly did you think the deputies were going to find when they arrived?" Priscilla's answer offered little beyond a defensive insistence that she had been acting in her residents' best interest, an explanation that satisfied nobody in that room once the full, rather embarrassing sequence of events had been laid out plainly for everyone present. The board voted to formally apologize to me in writing, to install proper signage of their own clearly marking the actual public easement path, separately from private property boundaries, throughout the development's surrounding area, and to establish a formal policy requiring board leadership to personally verify any reported emergency situation, to whatever reasonable extent time allowed, before escalating directly to 911 in situations involving property disputes rather than genuine physical danger. My gate still stands exactly where I installed it, and I'll admit that story has become something of a running joke among the deputies at the County Sheriff's Department, several of whom I've since met at community events who still bring up, with obvious amusement, the afternoon they responded to a reported kidnapping, and found nothing more than a very determined homeowner defending his own driveway from casual foot traffic. The shortcut traffic across my property stopped entirely once word of the incident spread through Hollow Ridge Estates, which I suppose means, in the end, that a padlock and a healthy dose of absurdity accomplished considerably more than 3 years of polite, repeatedly dismissed requests ever managed to. If this story hit home for you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep growing. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because there are plenty more stories just like this one still to come. Drop a comment down below and let me know what you thought of this one, or whether you've ever had a neighbor escalate something small into a genuinely absurd emergency. I read every single comment, and honestly, some of the best stories on this channel started as a comment somebody left on a video just like this.